Hello, welcome back. In this video, I'm going to discuss using imagination as a representational painter. When I first began painting, I thought observation and imagination were two completely different things. One had to do with technique and accuracy. The other had a lot more to do with creativity and expression. I think today, people tend to associate surrealism or fantasy art with artists who use their imagination to make their work. And I held these views for a long time as well. It wasn't until my training in the Boston School methods that my understanding of imagination and its role completely changed. So these aren't the end-all be-all, but here are the 5 most significant ways that I use imagination when painting. Okay, so number 1 is imagination as visualization. I think simply put, visualization is the ability to look at the subject and see it as a finished painting rather than as a thing to copy. So we're seeing a truthful interpretation of nature with fidelity to the overall impression, but specifically through selected effects that contribute the most to the overall appearance. That's the gist of what we're doing, and there could be a whole other video on that. But essentially, we need to hold the outcome in our mind's eye, and that's the thing that we're painting. Another way of putting it would be an athlete like Michael Jordan or Wayne Gretzky. You know, they take the winning shot, they make the winning goal. But there are interviews where they talk about how they visualized that outcome so well, so many times. They've rehearsed it in their mind so many times before it actually happened, that it was so natural and effortless in the moment that it occurred. That's exactly what we're doing when we're painting. We're seeing the entire painting and we're just creating that. All right, number 2, imagination as translation. The whole thing with painting is that we're taking 3D and converting it to 2D. Well, when we look at our subject, we have to translate all the things that we're seeing into painterly decisions. Painting is its own language. Where in the real world we see objects, when we're painting we're seeing values, edges, color relations, textures, shapes, and all those sorts of things. The imagination comes into play when we learn how to take what we're looking at and translate it into that language. Okay, number 3, painting as unification. I use my imagination to interpret the subject as the most cohesive, unified version of itself in value, form, and color. And I have to take a moment here to say, I'm not talking about details, because to make a detail, you have to distinguish something from something else. And those all become subplots. Unification is about learning how to merge the subplots to create the major plots of the picture. There's all sorts of ways that we can use our eyes to do this, to unify the values, forms, and colors. And those are things that I can talk about in another video. Okay, number 4, and this one's kind of fun. Imagination as association. Sometimes we have to use imagination through analogy. So for example, in this cast drawing, the hair reminded me of this great big mushroom cloud. You might look at it and see something different, but that was the analogy that I found. Having that image in my mind helped give me a reference for what I'm aiming for. Another example might be seeing 3 lines in relation to each other in gesture and timing. That orientation has a certain weight and feeling to it. Ultimately, these imaginative comparisons are tools for seeing more accurately. Finally, number 5, imagination as process. So in the beginning, I mentioned holding the outcome before executing. That was for the painting at large. When it comes to imagination as process, we're actually doing that same thing with each decision. For example, how to lay down a brush stroke. How does the paint feel when we put it on the canvas? In what order should we layer the paint? Even imagining ways of feeling when we're working that we haven't ever done before. all of these things become a mental rehearsal that kind of runs through the process. So for me, the most imaginative painters I know are the ones who can look at their subject and see it as a painting before ever making a single mark. That's a skill, and like any skill, it can be trained. So using the imagination has become an integral part of how I teach painting. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'd be happy to make a video in response to one of your questions, so if you got them, please leave them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.